Her last tear of the year didn't fall loudly. It didn't come with despair or collapse. It slipped down quietly, almost apologetically, as if even her sadness was tired of taking up space. She sat still, holding herself together in a way only exhausted people know how to do. Not broken enough to cry openly, not strong enough to pretend everything was fine. That tear carried months of restraint, nights of unanswered questions, mornings where she woke up already tired of trying to be hopeful. The year had asked too much of her. Too much patience. Too much faith without evidence. Too much strength in moments when she had nothing left to offer. She had done everything she knew how to do, and still, life had remained silent. There was a particular kind of pain in realizing that you survived the year, but didn't recognize yourself anymore. Not because you failed, but because you endured quietly. Because you learned how to stay standing even when no one noticed. She looked around and saw no dramatic loss, no visible collapse. Just the absence of answers. Just the heaviness of effort without confirmation. And somehow, that felt harder than falling apart. That last tear wasn't dramatic. It wasn't desperate. It was honest. A release she hadn't planned, marking the end of something she couldn't quite name. A silent acknowledgement that she had reached the edge of her strength. She didn't know it then, but that tear wasn't a sign of weakness. It wasn't the end of the story. It was the moment her resistance softened just enough for something else to move. Because sometimes, miracles don't arrive when we're loud with hope. They arrive when we finally stop holding everything together. And in that quiet, fragile moment, when her year seemed to be closing without answers, something invisible shifted. Not outwardly. Not yet. But deeply enough to change everything that would follow. The fear didn't come all at once. It settled slowly, quietly, like a shadow that stretches at the end of the day. Fear that nothing would change. Fear that this was simply how her life would feel now, restrained, unanswered, suspended in effort without response. She felt it most strongly in the silence, when there was no distraction left to soften the truth. Loneliness wasn't about being physically alone. It was about carrying so much internally with no place to set it down. She had learned how to be strong without asking, how to smile without explaining, how to keep going without being seen. But strength without release becomes heavy. And that weight had followed her all year. Discouragement whispered cruel questions late at night. What if this is all there is? What if I misunderstood the signs? What if I waited for something that was never coming? She didn't dramatize these thoughts. She carried them quietly, like many do, believing that questioning too loudly might make things worse. In one of those moments, she found herself wishing that someone, somewhere, could simply understand what this season felt like. Not to fix it. Just to witness it. And if you're listening to this story right now, perhaps you understand this weight too. If you do, maybe leave a word in the comments, something simple like, hope, not as a promise, but as a small acknowledgement that you're still here. She realized how powerful it felt to imagine that her story might reach someone else who was also holding everything together in silence. Someone who needed to hear that they weren't weak for feeling tired, or lost for feeling unsure. If this resonates with you, consider staying connected. Sometimes subscribing isn't about content. It's about choosing not to walk alone through quiet seasons. She also thought about the people she loved, the ones who hid their struggles behind competence and composure. The ones who rarely asked for help. If this story feels familiar, maybe it's meant to be shared. Sometimes a single story reaches where words fail. She took a slow breath, feeling the ache in her chest soften just slightly. Naming the weight didn't remove it, but it made it feel less isolating. Less invisible. And in that shared recognition, something subtle shifted. Because even in discouragement, there is connection. Even in loneliness, there is resonance. And even in silence, there is movement we cannot yet see. She didn't know it then, but this willingness to acknowledge the depth of her struggle, without hiding, without rushing, was already loosening the grip of the year that had nearly broken her. Looking back, she could trace the quiet disappointment through specific moments. Opportunities she believed were finally hers, dissolving without explanation. Conversations that ended with polite silence instead of clarity. Promises that felt real, only to quietly disappear. None of it dramatic enough to justify collapse, yet heavy enough to linger. Each closed door taught her how to manage disappointment privately. She learned how to nod in understanding while something inside her tightened. She learned how to accept rejection without asking questions. She learned how to move on before she was ready. Have you ever learned to move on before your heart had time to catch up? There were moments when she felt invisible in rooms where she once felt hopeful. As if her presence had become transparent, easily overlooked. Not because she lacked value, but because timing kept slipping just out of reach. Does this touch something inside you? She questioned herself in quiet ways. Not harshly, but persistently. Was she asking for too much? Was she meant to want something different? Was this season shaping her, or slowly erasing parts of her? Have you ever carried questions like these without answers? The weight of past failures didn't crush her. It exhausted her. Each attempt that didn't land took a small piece of her confidence, leaving her more careful, more contained. She didn't stop dreaming. She simply learned how to dream quietly. Have you ever hidden hope just to protect it? What hurt most wasn't the doors that closed, but the way she stopped expecting them to open. She adjusted her desires downward, not out of wisdom, but out of fatigue. She told herself it was maturity, when in truth, it was survival. Does this feel familiar? She realized that disappointment had become a companion, not a crisis. Something she lived with rather than reacted to. And in that adaptation, she lost a bit of her openness to possibility. Not entirely. Just enough to feel cautious about believing again. Still, something inside her resisted full resignation. A quiet part of her refused to let go completely, even when evidence suggested she should. That part didn't make noise. It waited patiently, holding on to something she couldn't yet name. Because even when doors close repeatedly, the heart remembers what it once wanted. And that memory, no matter how buried, carries the potential for something new. There was a time when hope came easily to her. It arrived without negotiation, without conditions. But after so many unanswered efforts, hope became something she handled with care, like a fragile object that could break if touched too directly. She didn't abandon it. She protected it by keeping it small. She noticed how often she now paused before allowing herself to feel excited. Before imagining something working out. Before believing that a shift was possible. This hesitation wasn't cynicism. It was a learned response to disappointment. Have you ever stopped yourself from hoping too quickly? She felt lost not because she lacked direction, but because nothing around her seemed to respond. She kept walking, kept trying, kept adjusting, yet movement didn't lead to clarity. It led to waiting. Does this touch something inside you? At times, she wondered whether she had missed something important along the way. A sign she didn't recognize. A decision she made too late. These thoughts didn't accuse her. They lingered gently, asking questions without offering answers. Have you ever searched your past for the moment everything shifted? What made it harder was the way others perceived her strength. From the outside, she looked composed. Capable. Resilient. Very few noticed the effort required to stay that way. Very few asked what it cost her to keep going. Have you ever felt unseen even when people admired you? She learned how to be functional in pain. How to show up while carrying uncertainty. How to remain dependable while feeling internally unsettled. These skills kept her moving, but they also created distance between her and her own needs. She rarely spoke about how tired she felt of being patient, of trusting timing without evidence, of believing in outcomes that never arrived. She didn't complain. She adapted. But adaptation, over time, can feel like quiet loss. Still, beneath all that restraint, something remained intact. A small, steady awareness that this wasn't the end of her story. She didn't know why she felt it, only that it refused to disappear. And sometimes, that was enough to keep her from giving up entirely. Because even when hope becomes guarded, it doesn't disappear. It waits, quietly, for the moment it can breathe again. There were days when she felt as if life was moving in a rhythm she could no longer hear. Everyone else seemed to step forward with certainty, while she remained suspended between effort and waiting. It wasn't envy that hurt her. It was the sense of being out of sync, like arriving late to a song everyone else already knew. She tried to tell herself that comparison was unnecessary, but the feeling persisted quietly. Watching others receive what she had prayed for created a strange mix of joy and grief inside her. She celebrated for them sincerely, yet felt the absence of movement in her own life more sharply afterward. Have you ever smiled for someone else while something inside you ached? There were moments when she questioned whether she still belonged to the life she was building. Whether her dreams were outdated. Whether her persistence was wisdom or stubbornness. These thoughts didn't overwhelm her. They accompanied her, gently but persistently, asking to be acknowledged. Does this feel familiar to you? She felt lonely in a way that couldn't be solved by company. Surrounded by people, yet alone in her inner landscape. She didn't want advice. She didn't want reassurance. She wanted resonance, someone who understood the weight of trying without visible results. Have you ever wished to be understood without having to explain? The exhaustion she carried wasn't physical. It lived deeper, in the constant recalibration of expectations. In learning how not to expect too much. In convincing herself that stillness was part of the plan, even when it felt endless. She became skilled at enduring, but endurance slowly replaced joy. Sometimes, late at night, she wondered how long she could keep moving without confirmation. How long she could believe without evidence. These questions didn't scare her. They simply existed, waiting for answers that never seemed to arrive. Have you ever waited for clarity that felt just out of reach? Still, she continued. Not because she was certain, but because something inside her refused to stop. A quiet determination, uncelebrated and unseen, carried her through days that felt repetitive and unresolved. She didn't realize it then, but this persistence was shaping something important. Because even when life feels out of sync, it doesn't mean you've missed your moment. Sometimes, it means your moment is preparing you first. The turning point did not arrive as a miracle. It arrived as a pause. A moment so ordinary that she almost dismissed it. She was alone, not searching for answers anymore, just trying to breathe through the weight of the year. And in that quiet, something softened inside her enough for a new thought to land. It came through a simple encounter. A few words she overheard. A page she opened without intention. A message that spoke about alignment instead of effort, about allowing instead of forcing. It wasn't dramatic. It was precise. And something inside her recognized it immediately, as if it had been waiting for this language all along. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel blamed for her stillness. The idea of the law of attraction didn't suggest she had failed. It suggested she had been preparing. That her inner state mattered as much as her actions. That timing responded to alignment, not exhaustion. Have you ever felt relief just from being understood? She felt something shift in her chest, not excitement, but recognition. A quiet, yes, that didn't need explanation. It felt like someone had finally named what she had been sensing but couldn't articulate. That maybe the silence wasn't resistance. Maybe it was refinement. That was when she found the manifestation journal. Not as a tool to control outcomes, but as a space to reconnect with herself. Holding it felt different from planning or goal setting. It felt intimate. Like an invitation to speak honestly with the universe without demanding immediate answers. She opened the first page slowly, unsure of what to write. There was no performance here. No affirmations she didn't yet believe. Just truth. She wrote about how tired she was. How much she had tried. How unsure she felt about what came next. And instead of feeling weaker, she felt lighter. For the first time all year, she wasn't trying to fix her life. She was listening to it. Allowing herself to be present without judgment. That presence created space. And in that space, something subtle but powerful began to move. She didn't know it yet, but this moment, quiet, uncelebrated, deeply personal, was the beginning of her miracle. Not because everything changed instantly, but because she finally stopped resisting where she was. And sometimes, that is the exact moment when the universe begins to respond. She didn't rush to change everything at once. There was no dramatic declaration, no rigid routine. She began gently, almost cautiously, allowing herself to explore this new way of relating to life without expectation. The manifestation journal became a place of honesty rather than performance. Each morning, she wrote a few lines. Not about what she wanted to fix, but about what she was willing to feel. Some days, that meant writing gratitude for small, almost invisible things. A quiet morning. A moment of calm. The fact that she was still trying. She wrote slowly, letting the words settle before turning the page. She began practicing affirmations, not as demands, but as reminders. Soft statements spoken internally, without urgency. She didn't force belief. She allowed familiarity. Repeating them until her nervous system felt safe hearing hope again. Visualization came naturally. Not grand images of success, but simple scenes of peace. Herself waking without heaviness. Herself moving through the day with ease. Herself trusting that something unseen was aligning in her favor. These images felt calming rather than aspirational. Gratitude became her anchor. Not gratitude for outcomes, but for presence. For breath. For the ability to notice what was still intact. She returned to one phrase often, letting it guide her when doubt crept in: gratitude is the miracle that keeps the universe in motion. It didn't feel like a quote. It felt like truth. At night, she returned to the manifestation journal. She reflected without judgment. She acknowledged what felt heavy and what felt lighter. There was no pressure to feel positive. Only permission to be real. And that honesty created a quiet sense of alignment. She noticed how these practices softened her resistance. The tension she carried began to loosen. Not because life had changed yet, but because she had changed how she met it. That shift created space for something new to enter. For the first time, she wasn't asking the universe to prove anything. She was meeting it halfway, with openness instead of demand. And that made all the difference. She didn't know when the miracle would arrive. But she felt, deeply, that she had begun to walk toward it, calmly, intentionally, and without fear. The first signs didn't arrive as solutions. They arrived as moments. Small, almost dismissible experiences that felt gently timed rather than coincidental. A sentence she overheard that mirrored something she had written the night before. A message that arrived exactly when doubt began to rise. A sense of being answered without being explained. She noticed how often these moments appeared when she wasn't looking for them. When she was present. When she was grounded. When she had stopped scanning the horizon for proof. It felt as though life was responding to her calm rather than her effort. There were subtle shifts in how her body felt throughout the day. Less tension in her chest. less urgency in her thoughts. She caught herself smiling for no specific reason, surprised by the ease of it. These weren't breakthroughs. They were confirmations that something was aligning quietly. She began to trust her intuition more. Small nudges guided her choices. To pause instead of pushing. To rest instead of forcing. To listen instead of reacting. And each time she followed that inner signal, things unfolded with less resistance. The manifestation journal started to reflect this shift. Her entries changed tone. Less asking. More noticing. Less questioning. More allowing. She didn't need to name the signs for them to feel real. She felt them in the steadiness of her days. There were moments she almost dismissed these changes, telling herself they were insignificant. But something inside her recognized their importance. Miracles rarely announce themselves loudly at first. They begin as whispers, asking to be noticed without being chased. She realized she didn't need to understand everything that was happening. She only needed to stay open to it. To remain present long enough to receive what was already moving toward her. If something in this moment resonates with you, you don't need to explain it. Just let it be acknowledged. If you feel it, simply comment, "I receive." The changes didn't arrive all at once. They arrived in pieces, each one small enough not to overwhelm her, yet meaningful enough to be undeniable. A door that had been closed reopened without explanation. A conversation shifted tone. An opportunity appeared where there had only been silence before. She noticed how help began to show up naturally. Not forced. Not requested. People offered support without being asked. Information arrived at the right moment. Timing felt cooperative rather than resistant. It was subtle, but it was real. Emotionally, something lifted. The heaviness she had carried for so long began to loosen its grip. She felt lighter moving through her days, less guarded, more open. The fear that once accompanied every decision softened, replaced by a quiet sense of trust. Clarity followed. She no longer felt scattered or unsure about her next steps. Even when she didn't have all the answers, she knew which direction felt aligned. That knowing was calm, not urgent. Grounded, not anxious. She returned to the manifestation journal with a different energy. Now she wasn't writing to release pain. She was writing to integrate change. To acknowledge movement. To anchor gratitude for what was unfolding. The pages began to reflect momentum instead of waiting. She realized that the miracle wasn't a single event. It was a sequence. A series of aligned moments that together created transformation. Nothing felt accidental anymore. Everything felt connected. She understood then that when life begins to move, it doesn't ask for permission. It responds to readiness. And she was ready now, not because she had forced belief, but because she had learned how to receive. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't bracing herself against disappointment. She was allowing herself to trust what was happening, gently, steadily, and without fear. And that trust became the foundation for everything that followed. As the days unfolded, she sensed a quiet expansion taking place. Not loud, not rushed, but unmistakable. Life felt less like something happening to her and more like something responding with intention. She moved through her routines with a new awareness, as if the ground beneath her steps had finally become stable. Support appeared in ways she hadn't anticipated. Encouragement came without solicitation. Recognition arrived without effort. She didn't chase alignment anymore. She noticed it. And that noticing allowed her to remain present rather than overwhelmed by growth. Inside, something awakened. A sense of destiny, not grand or dramatic, but deeply personal. She began to feel that her experiences were no longer random. They were connected, woven together by meaning she could finally feel rather than question. There were moments when she paused simply to acknowledge how different her inner dialogue sounded now. The doubt that once dominated her thoughts had softened. In its place lived a quiet affirmation she returned to often, almost like a prayer: "Today, I choose to believe." This belief wasn't blind optimism. It was informed by everything she had survived, learned, and integrated. She believed not because everything was perfect, but because she trusted herself to meet whatever arrived next with presence and discernment. She noticed how this belief shaped her actions. She spoke with clarity. She chose with confidence. She rested without guilt. Expansion no longer felt threatening. It felt deserved. The manifestation journal reflected this inner awakening. Her entries carried intention rather than uncertainty. Gratitude rather than longing. She documented moments not to prove they were happening, but to honor them. She understood now that awakening isn't an event. It's a shift in perception. A moment when life begins to feel like a collaborator instead of an obstacle. And with that understanding, she stepped further into this expansion, grounded by belief and guided by trust. What surprised her most was how safe expansion felt now. She had once imagined growth as something that demanded more from her, more effort, more proving, more endurance. Instead, it arrived as permission. Permission to receive without questioning, to hold without fear of loss, to move forward without bracing for collapse. She noticed how her nervous system responded differently to good news. Where excitement once triggered anxiety, it now brought calm. She could feel joy without immediately anticipating its disappearance. This alone felt like a miracle she hadn't known to ask for. Opportunities continued to unfold, but they no longer defined her worth. She engaged with them from a place of choice rather than urgency. She accepted what resonated and declined what didn't, trusting that alignment mattered more than accumulation. Her sense of self expanded alongside her circumstances. She no longer shrank to fit uncertainty or overextended to feel deserving. She occupied her life fully, allowing herself to be present in moments that once would have felt intimidating. The manifestation journal became a witness to this stability. She wrote not to convince herself that things were changing, but to remain grounded as they did. Each page anchored her in gratitude, reminding her that receiving required presence as much as effort once had. She recognized how far she had come from the woman who guarded hope carefully. Now, hope moved freely through her days, not as expectation, but as trust. Trust that she could hold whatever came next without losing herself. There was a maturity to this phase that felt deeply reassuring. Expansion no longer needed to impress. It needed to last. And everything unfolding carried that quality, steady, intentional, and rooted. She understood now that miracles don't always arrive as dramatic transformations. Sometimes, they arrive as the ability to remain open, grounded, and whole while life finally meets you where you stand. And with this knowing, she continued forward, confident not because she controlled the future, but because she trusted herself within it. As the weeks unfolded, her world began to feel wider. Not louder, not chaotic, but fuller. Possibilities that once felt distant now felt accessible, as if life itself had leaned closer to meet her. She no longer felt confined to survival or recovery. She felt available for expansion. New opportunities emerged in ways she couldn't have orchestrated. Invitations arrived naturally. Ideas flowed with clarity. Conversations opened paths she hadn't considered before. Each new development felt aligned, not forced, as though life was responding to her inner coherence rather than her effort. Emotionally, she experienced a new kind of abundance. Not the rush of excitement she once chased, but a deep sense of fulfillment that lingered. She felt supported, not just by circumstances, but by her own capacity to receive without fear. This emotional richness became the foundation for everything else. Professionally, doors opened that reflected her growth. Recognition followed her readiness rather than her urgency. She stepped into spaces that once intimidated her with a sense of belonging she hadn't known before. She no longer questioned whether she deserved to be there. She knew she did. The manifestation journal remained a constant companion through this expansion. She documented insights, synchronicities, and moments of gratitude that anchored her as life widened around her. The pages reminded her of where she had been and how intentionally she had arrived here. She noticed how expansion no longer pulled her away from herself. Instead, it deepened her connection. She moved forward without abandoning her boundaries or her peace. Growth felt integrated, not consuming. She understood now that abundance is not about accumulation alone. It is about alignment. When your inner world is ready, the outer world reflects that readiness with generosity and flow. And as her life expanded in ways she once only imagined, she remained grounded in gratitude, knowing that this widening was not the end of her journey, it was the beginning of a new chapter, shaped by everything she had learned along the way. As expansion continued, she noticed how alignment began to touch every area of her life, not just the ones she had focused on healing. Relationships felt lighter. Conversations flowed without the tension she once carried. She no longer felt the need to explain herself or justify her pace. Presence had replaced performance. Emotionally, she felt a steadiness that allowed her to stay open without feeling exposed. She could connect deeply without losing herself. She could give without depletion. This balance felt new and sacred, the result of everything she had learned during the year that nearly broke her. Her professional life reflected this inner shift as well. She moved with confidence that didn't demand attention but naturally drew it. People responded to her clarity, her calm, her grounded way of engaging with challenges. Recognition came as a reflection, not a pursuit. She continued writing in her manifestation journal, not to ask for more, but to remain aligned with what was already unfolding. The journal became a mirror of her growth, a record of how far she had come from the days of guarded hope and quiet endurance. She felt deeply connected to her own timing now. There was no rush to arrive anywhere else. Each moment felt purposeful, even the pauses. She trusted that life was no longer testing her patience, but honoring her readiness. Gratitude expanded naturally within her. It wasn't forced or performative. It arose from witnessing how life responded when she stopped resisting where she was. She understood now that gratitude doesn't deny pain. It integrates it. She carried a sense of inner abundance that no longer depended on outcomes. Even as things grew externally, her peace remained internal. This made her expansion feel sustainable, grounded, and real. She realized that alignment isn't a destination. It's a way of moving. A way of choosing. A way of listening. And she was living it now, moment by moment, without fear of losing it. As her life continued to open in unexpected ways, she remained rooted in trust, knowing that everything arriving was meeting her exactly where she was meant to be. As her life continued to align, she noticed something unexpected happening. Her journey, once lived quietly and almost invisibly, began to reach beyond her own experience. People started to listen differently when she spoke. They asked questions. They leaned in, not out of curiosity, but recognition. She didn't set out to inspire anyone. She simply spoke from where she had been and where she now stood. And somehow, that honesty resonated. Others saw pieces of themselves in her words, in her pauses, in the way she described silence without bitterness. Her story became a bridge. Opportunities to share her perspective appeared gently. Invitations arrived without pressure. Conversations unfolded naturally into moments of exchange, where her experience offered clarity rather than advice. She realized that what she had lived carried meaning not only for her, but for those who were still waiting in quiet seasons of their own. Recognition felt different than she had imagined. It wasn't overwhelming or exposing. It felt affirming. Like life was saying, this mattered. Not because of success, but because of truth. She felt safe being seen now, safe allowing her story to exist beyond her private pages. She understood that visibility wasn't about standing above others. It was about standing beside them, showing that silence can transform, that endurance can soften into alignment, that waiting can lead somewhere real. And if this part of her journey touches something in you, you don't have to analyze it. A simple acknowledgement is enough. You can leave a word in the comments that reflects what you're opening yourself to, or choose to stay connected by subscribing if stories like this speak to you. She carried this recognition lightly, without attachment. She didn't need applause to validate what she had lived. She trusted that her story would land where it was meant to land, when it was meant to land. What mattered most was that she no longer hid her journey. She allowed it to exist fully, not as a lesson, but as a living reminder that quiet seasons can shape something powerful. And as her story continued to ripple outward, she remained grounded in the truth that had guided her all along. Alignment speaks softly at first, but its impact travels far. With time, she began to understand something that had once escaped her. That last tear of the year had not been a breaking point. It had been a release. A moment where she stopped holding the weight together and allowed herself to be fully honest with life. That honesty created space. And space invites movement. She realized that the universe often waits for truth, not effort. It listens for surrender, not struggle. That tear was the first moment she stopped negotiating with pain and simply acknowledged it. In doing so, she aligned herself with something deeper than hope, acceptance. She reflected on how often she had tried to be strong when what she needed was to be real. Strength had kept her going, but vulnerability had opened the door. The tear carried permission. Permission to soften. Permission to stop proving. Permission to receive. From that moment on, everything that followed made sense. The silence. The pause. The subtle shift. None of it was accidental. The universe had not responded to desperation. It had responded to coherence. To the moment her inner world matched what she had been asking for all along. She noticed how different her relationship with emotion had become. She no longer feared tears or quiet moments. She trusted them. They were messengers, not failures. Each one carried information rather than weakness. She returned to her manifestation journal and reread the early pages. The ones filled with fatigue and uncertainty. Instead of feeling sadness, she felt gratitude. Those words had marked the moment she stopped resisting reality and began aligning with it. She understood now that miracles don't always begin with faith. Sometimes, they begin with honesty. With the willingness to admit where you are without shame or urgency to escape it. That tear, so quiet and unnoticed at the time, had been the first sign. Not of loss, but of readiness. And once readiness appeared, the universe had no reason to remain silent. She noticed that something subtle had changed in how she moved through her days. She was no longer waiting for proof before allowing herself to feel at peace. She wasn't scanning her life for signs of confirmation. She was living inside the unfolding, present enough to receive what arrived without questioning whether it would last. This shift didn't come with certainty about the future. It came with trust in the present. A trust that didn't need guarantees. She understood now that waiting had once been her way of protecting herself from disappointment. Receiving required courage, the courage to stay open even when outcomes were still forming. She allowed herself to enjoy moments without measuring them against what might come next. Joy no longer felt dangerous. Calm no longer felt temporary. She experienced her life as something she was participating in, not something she was enduring until it changed. Her manifestation journal reflected this evolution clearly. The pages no longer carried longing. They carried acknowledgement. She wrote about what was happening now, not what she hoped might happen someday. That presence anchored her deeply in alignment. She felt more available emotionally, more connected to her intuition, more responsive to the rhythm of her own life. Decisions felt simpler because they were guided by resonance rather than fear. She trusted herself to recognize what belonged and what didn't. She realized that miracles don't always announce themselves as arrivals. Sometimes they reveal themselves as shifts in how we relate to our own lives. The miracle was not only what changed around her, but how she changed within it. She understood that receiving is an active state. It requires awareness, openness, and the willingness to remain present even when the moment feels ordinary. That presence allowed her to notice how consistently life was now meeting her halfway. And in this state of quiet receptivity, she felt grounded, steady, and whole. Not because everything was complete, but because she was no longer waiting to begin living. Looking back now, she no longer wondered why the year had ended the way it did. That last tear hadn't been a failure of faith. It had been the moment her heart stopped fighting reality and allowed truth to surface. And truth, when honored, becomes alignment. She understood that the universe doesn't respond to performance. It responds to presence. That quiet tear carried everything she hadn't been able to say out loud, the fatigue, the patience, the faith that had survived without proof. It was not a breakdown. It was a signal. From that moment forward, nothing needed to be forced. Life responded not because she tried harder, but because she finally softened. The miracle didn't rush in loudly. It unfolded steadily, respectfully, meeting her where she was instead of pulling her somewhere else. She no longer questioned whether she had imagined the shift. She felt it in how grounded she was. In how safe hope felt again. In how the future no longer scared her, even though it remained unknown. That sense of safety was the real miracle. She realized that endings are not always closures. Sometimes, they are openings disguised as exhaustion. Sometimes, the last tear of the year is not grief, it's readiness. And if you're here, listening to this story, maybe you're standing in a similar moment. Maybe something in you is tired of holding everything together. Maybe you're sensing that a quiet release could be the beginning of something new. This is your reminder that miracles don't require perfection. They require honesty. They begin when you allow yourself to be where you truly are, without shame, without urgency, without resistance. If this story touched you, let your presence be felt. Leave a word in the comments that represents what you're opening yourself to. Stay connected by subscribing if stories like this resonate with your journey. And share this message with someone who may be standing at the edge of a quiet turning point. Because sometimes, the universe waits for just one thing. Not effort. Not certainty. Just truth. And the moment truth is honored, everything begins to move.